Everyone and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian. I'm the director of the Stonewall Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And it's just a few days after Thanksgiving in 2021. And we are very happy to have the author of The Wrong End of the Telescope, Rabih Alameddine, here. How are you? Nice to see you, Robbie.
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you? And thank you for having me.
Well, we're very happy to have you here. We're looking forward to talking about the book and talking about your career. Just for those who are not familiar with the Stonewall Museum and Archives, we are located here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've been here for about 43 years. We are the largest LGBTQ library in the world. There are over 28,000 volumes in the library. And it is actually believed to be the largest queer library anywhere. Many of the volumes are contained in other museums on academic campuses and metropolitan areas, but the power, of course, is seeing all of these volumes together in one place. In addition to the 28,000 in the lending library, we have over 1,500 rare books signed in first editions by queer authors going back to the 19th century to the present day, and those are available for research as well. In addition to the archive, in addition to the library, we have an archive. We started the archive about 20 years ago, and it measures 2,700 linear feet. And when I first started doing this, I had no idea what that meant, but 2,700 feet gets you all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. That totals 6 million pages of gay history, starting mostly from 1950 to the present day. There's serials, subject matter files, complete runs of everything from early things like, After Dark and The Advocate and real pioneers out there, the Bay Area Reporter, some early San Francisco publications as well as many which are very deep in Florida as well. Our Florida holdings are quite extensive because we've been here in South Florida for so long. We also have a number of collections which are unique to the Stonewall Library. We had an individual who was who started something called the Southern Gay Liberator in 1973, and it was just a 4-page pamphlet about what was happening in the gay world in 1973, 74, 75. And he sent it to every gay newspaper and pamphlet he could find. And he said, if I send you mine, will you send me yours? And that went on for 20 or 30 years. And all of those copies have come to Stonewall. And all of those originals have come to Stonewall. In many cases, the only known paper copy to exist. We were just asked by the University of Mississippi to digitize This Month in Mississippi, which is just a little tiny pamphlet like this that talks about gay life in Mississippi. Anyway, so it's very rich. It's been a resource for gay researchers and writers. And if you have papers or books that you would like to donate, of course, that's how we get them. In addition to the library and the archive, we do exhibitions, and the exhibitions come primarily out of the archive. There are 2 up right now. One is called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which is the tortured 250-year relationship between the US military and the LGBTQ community. We start with George Washington and the openly gay general who was arrested for sodomy in 1798, and we end up with Joseph Biden and the fact that all members of the LGBTQ community can proudly serve in the military. And that's important as we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the end of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which was, of course, a disaster for many people. So if you're here in Fort Lauderdale, you can come by and see that. And a few weeks ago, we opened a new exhibition called Misinformation, which is the true and not so true information about early days in the AIDS epidemic. And what we do is we go back to July 1981, when the first news story came out in the New York Times about this mysterious disease that was affecting gay men, both in California and in New York. And we start looking at some of the similarities of the rumors and lies and mistruths that were out there in the 1980s about HIV and AIDS, and making the comparison to what has been going on in the last 18 months in the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really fascinating to see some of the exact same language used in both of those situations, one 40 years after the other. So please stop by and see that one as well too. This series is part of a series of oral histories and public presentations that we're doing to bring contemporary writers, thinkers, artists, and critics to our audience. If you're here with us on Zoom, hello. And if you have a question, please feel free to just drop it into the chat, and we will be monitoring those. We'll be able to ask your question. And if you're there on Facebook, we have many people who follow us on Facebook as well too. Hello to everybody on Facebook, and we will be happy to answer your questions as well too. I want to do a shout out to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's here behind the scenes. Hello, Paula. Nice to see you tonight.
Hey, Hunter.
Thank you. Thank you for all your help on this. And finally, I just want to do a thank you to our friends at the Our Fund Foundation, because they're located here. They're one of the largest gay community foundations. They're located here in South Florida in Fort Lauderdale, and they provide us with the support in order to be able to make this program happen. So that's all the business that I have to do. Robbie, let's get back to you. How is your day going?
How is
your day going?
It's well. I had class this morning, and yeah, it's going fine.
Where are we finding you this evening?
I am in Charlottesville, Virginia.
And you were an artist in residence there, I believe, right?
Yes. I think I always like to say I am the distinguished visiting writer or something like that. Yes, I'm here for a year with the possible extension of another. This is the first time I've done something like this for a while. So it's been interesting. It's been interesting.
So do you have a teaching load? Or
Yes, I do. I'm teaching 2 classes this semester, which ends in a couple of weeks, and then 2 classes next semester. And again, I'm the type of writer who works. Shall we say, habit is a big part of my life. I've written 7 books in one chair, which is back in San Francisco. Yeah. And so since I've been here, I haven't been able to do much of anything. So I don't know how. Something has to change for it to work.
Did you come with a project in mind?
Kind of. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that my project wasn't solid enough. But again, it's the habit of having, all the morning off and doing nothing, and then coming and then sitting down and like I said, the same chair, with my cats jumping on top of me and stuff. Yeah, now, I mean, I have the cats, I have everything, I don't have the chair. And I'm blaming that.
Well, yeah. So what if somebody ships the chair out to you? What's your excuse going to be then?
I don't know. Yeah, it's a different situation. Partly it's also just like things on my mind. The book came out, so there's all kinds of things that go with the book. I'm teaching 2 classes. I'm meeting constantly. I'm thinking about it. I'm actually thinking about my next semester.
Yeah.
So it's like all this is on my mind, so maybe that's why. But still, I blame the chair. I want my chair.
Well, I'm sure it can be arranged. But of course, many people at residencies, have that same lament that even though they're given the time and the space to do the work there, that sometimes outside of their normal creative cocoon, it's difficult for them to get things going. But anyway, as you know, you were born to a Lebanese family in Jordan, and you lived there, and you lived in Kuwait, and then you lived in London. And I guess it was just prior to the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War, your family moved to London, and then you No.
My family didn't move. They sent me away. I went to boarding school.
Yeah.
I was 15, and it was when the Civil War started, when things became obvious.
And so were you the only child to get out in the family?
No, my the middle sister, who was she was 13 at the time, she went out as well, but she went to it's like they were trying to find places for us. She went to a boarding school in Europe, not in actually, so did I. But then I came to the United States, but she went back to Lebanon.
Yeah.
As she likes to say, she's not academically inclined.
How old were you when you came to the US?
17.
Wow.
17,
And so is the US where you got your engineering and your business degrees?
Yes. Yeah. California specifically, because again, now that I'm staying in Virginia, I'm beginning to realize that there are different countries in this country.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That is for sure.
So I first arrived in California, in Los Angeles, and I've never left California. I mean,
yeah. Did you have family there as well?
No. I was by myself.
Wow.
Again, I've lived by myself. I quote unquote left home the first time when I was 10. My parents were still in Kuwait and they wanted me to get a better education, so they sent me to live with my aunt in Lebanon. So between the ages of 10 and 14, I was living with my aunt. And then my parents came to Lebanon. We lived together for a year, and then the war started and I left again. So I was used to being by myself.
What drew you to California?
Movies. I mean, again, I was 17. I knew nothing about anything. All I knew was that, when I saw movies about the United States, it was in California mostly. That's what I wanted, those tequilas on the beach. This was my vision of the United States.
Yeah. What do you remember? Any titles of the movies you were seeing?
There was one, and I think I looked it up once, and I think it came up. It came after I arrived, but in my mind, that was the movie. I think it was called Tequila Sunrise or something like that. That's why I mentioned tequila. But I think that came later.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I remember, I was 16 and I see this movie with, Venice Beach, and I'm thinking like, yeah, this I can see myself there.
And so, at that time, you didn't imagine yourself being a writer because you ended up going to engineering school and business school. So did you think of yourself as being a writer?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah. I just didn't. First of all, I never thought writing was a profession per se. I always thought, writing is something you did on the side. Before he died, my father reminded me that when I was 4, he asked me what I wanted to do with my life. And I said, I wanted to be a writer. And at 4, basically, I wanted to write Superman comics, which is what I was reading. And Batman and Nancy. I loved Nancy.
Nancy and Sluggo.
Sluggo. Yeah. In Arabic, it's Balut or Lulu. But Lulu and Balut. So that's Nancy and Sluggo. And I loved them. I loved all comics, and I wanted to do that. So I've been wanting to write for a long, long time. Because again, I'm a reader. I just never thought of it. I didn't know any better. I had no clue what I wanted to do. I was the first in my family. I had a couple of cousins, I guess, who went to university, but I was the first in my family to go to. I didn't know who to ask, like what were the possibilities and stuff like that. So I was very, very good at math. So I decided to do engineering. I knew that something was off when the free electives, we're talking 40 years ago, I still remember some of those things, that the free electives, that everybody was taking these easy classes, and I was taking Shakespeare because that's what I wanted. And so I realized that maybe I was not meant to be an engineer. But
Did you ever practice as an engineer?
For about 9 months, of which 5 were vacation. 5 months were vacation. I mean, it's a biggie, you know, in our culture, particularly during that time, but it's still there. There are 2 options. If you are smart enough, there are 2 options. You can't, you know, you have no other choice. You're either a doctor or an engineer. Anything else is considered, you know, you weren't smart enough to become a doctor or an engineer. So lawyers, business people, teachers, whatever, they're in the Middle East. I mean, from Iran, even to India and stuff, it was either doctor or engineer. You know, those are the 2 things. So for me, it was obviously an engineer because I was very, very good at math.
Mm.
I seriously did not have an inkling that I could have done something else.
But also,
Now, but the important thing is that I don't regret it. Being an engineer has helped me a great deal, not in engineering, but in how I think and how I am able to see things 3-dimensionally, how to research, how to think about, you know, like if I'm talking writing, how to think about a plot and its sequencing. All that comes from an engineering training.
Yeah, no, I think that's very good. I think a lot of professional degrees are very good in creative practice. And so I happen to have a law degree. I understand it's a lesser degree, but
failure.
But yes, I mean, I totally understand what you're saying. It's interesting though that somebody who, as a child, and I hear you talk about, you know, the Batman and Superman comic books and Nancy and Sluggo, but you were obviously reading other books. You knew that individuals were writing books.
Yes.
But perhaps you didn't have anybody in your closest family circle or around you who provided a role model for being a writer to allow that to be something that you could be.
There were always talk about, on my mother's side, there were a couple of poets, but they weren't, I mean, it's hard to say they weren't real poets because they published poetry, but one of them was an ambassador. You know, my mother's family was more educated and you know, different than my father's family. But, you know, there was no one, it's like everybody, whatever writers I knew, writing for them was sort of like a hobby.
Yeah.
Something you did, like, aren't I special? I can write poetry.
Yeah. It is unfortunate that we do live, and there are many cultures in which the idea of pursuit of a creative career is in many cases second to something which is going to make money, and that's unfortunate.
It's again, it's not just, yeah, it's about what we prioritize. And in the culture that I grew up with, which is the one difference and over here, is that it wasn't not just realistic. It's like, it's out of the question, you know. What does it mean to make money as a writer? Books don't sell, you know. It's like, it's just not real. So
I think particularly for a man, because there was an additional set of responsibilities that you should support your wife and your children, and you had an obligation.
I never had that issue.
So how did you escape that?
Easily. I mean, my family was traditional in many, many ways and untraditional in other ways. And, you know, I would always say my family loved me. My father, my mother, and my sisters, they loved me I mean, they had a lot of issues, and they, particularly my father, tried to direct me in certain places, but he was always accepting.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I've always joked that I've had to come up to him 3 times because, you know, he always sort of strategically forgot that I came out to him. So I would have to, you know, like, no, Dad, I'm not getting married, and no, you know. But he was, again, supportive throughout in his way.
Right. Right. And of course, that's an important thing to remember too, about somebody being supportive in their way.
Yeah.
When you got to California, did you, well, you said you were 16 or 17. Did you feel you were out at the time?
Yes and no. I mean, I was out. I was out and I was having, crazy sex all over the place. Again, this was Los Angeles in 1977, 78. I want to say the peak of my sexual experience was then. But I did not tell friends. And it became a fascinating thing for me. I started thinking about it and writing about it for a while, that I had sort of two separate lives, a gay life and a straight life. The straight life was Lebanese. So in Los Angeles, when I first arrived, most of my friends were Lebanese. I had to, expand my circle when I was about 20, 21. To be able to come out, I had to go out of the limits of how I saw the world. And it's a difficult thing to describe. Maybe not, a lot of us now are multicultural and have gone through similar experiences. I had to come out as a gay man, as an American first, before I was able to do it as a Lebanese. I have to say, I was never closeted. I've never pretended to have a girlfriend. I never told anyone I was straight. My father, when I was 15, asked me if I was gay, and I said, well, I think I'm somewhere in between. So I was never closeted per se, but I never, brought up my sexuality until it got integrated at some point.
Yeah. And of course, when you went to Los Angeles in the late 70s, it was just a few years after that the first part of the AIDS epidemic started there, and you were a witness, possibly an active participant to some degree, of watching what was going on with everybody around you. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that time.
Well, I've been HIV positive probably since that time. Like I said, those were the crazy years for me, as in, I was 17 and I wanted to try everything. But I don't think I really knew about it. By 81, 82, I was back I was in San Francisco going for my graduate degree. And that's when the news started filtering. I believe, I knew that most probably there was this one night in 82 where I, zero converted. I think I can remember the night, but who knows?
Yes, I watched in many ways, it doesn't matter necessarily.
No, it matters. It matters for me, because now if it was like 82, I can say I've been 40 years. Yay! It matters to me in terms of history, not what I did or whether I'm a big fan of I mine my past for material.
Well, so you have to be a good archivist of your own history.
Yes, an archivist of memories. And most of the time, I think it's not true what I'm archiving, but I don't care. If it's mine, then it has a little bit more power. But yes, so again, I do not know whether that was the night, but I remember it clearly. And one of these days, I'm going to write about, what would make a 21-year-old go out and do something completely insane, knowing that there might be something out there. I'm fascinated by that subject anyway. So yes, I watched. In 82, friend of mine and I started a gay soccer team, the San Francisco Spikes. We actually once played in a gay tournament in Fort Lauderdale.
Oh, really?
Yeah, can't remember the year, late 90s maybe, or maybe 92, something like that. Anyway, no, 2002, I think. Anyway, see, when at my age, the years just pile up together. We started in 82, played in the first Olympic Games, and then in 86, and we started growing. I wrote about this time, and I noticed that by 1996, half the team was dead. You know, so we watched the transition, we saw it, and then we saw when it came back to you know, when we started having possibilities, basically, of improving.
Right, right. Do you carry anger today about that time period?
All you have to do is go Reagan, and I will shoot the screen.
Yeah, right.
Yes. How can you not? I mean, how can? I mean, my first book dealt with the AIDS epidemic, and then, you know, I put it aside for a while and stuff. But I returned 20 years later, and I returned for The Angel of History 20 years later, because I realized that I had all this anger that was just completely not handled. And what was important to me in the book itself is that the anger is not directed at the world, although there's a lot of that. It was directed at me because I allowed the world to forget. You know, that when Hillary Clinton can say something like, oh, you know, Nancy Reagan was great for AIDS, and I shoot the television, you know, it's not Hillary that's the problem. It's me. It's that I allowed the world to forget what happened. You know, luckily, some of us, I mean, it's funny because I'm reading Sarah Schulman's book, and some of us are trying to, as she says, set the record straight.
Yes, yeah, and it's an amazing book that Sarah has, and it's a true tour de force, and it is important. I mean, even people like Avram and Grand Fury that are still out there working and trying to get the message out there that it's very important. It's even why, you know, the show that we have at Stonewall right now is just trying to find another way of looking at the same problem.
Which I would love to talk to whoever curated that show, because next semester I'm giving a class on the literature of AIDS, and specifically what the literature of AIDS can help in terms of predicting what the literature of the next pandemic or this pandemic is. So we'll talk after.
Yeah, offline, we can definitely share some of those resources. As an aside about that, about 7 years ago, the Stonewall Library had 2 doctors come through and look at all of our HIV and AIDS books, and those that they thought that were no longer factually accurate were taken off the shelves. But they weren't destroyed, which is a very good thing. Those books were saved, and they're about 80 or 90 of those volumes. And so they've been sitting in the archive, all of those books. And I've been sort of very interested about wanting to do something with them, that there's all this misinformation that was so harmful to so many people, and yet it was saved, which is an important thing. And that is what we used for that exhibition, was all of those books and all that bad information. So it's not literature per se in the sense that it's not prose, but it represents the books and the misinformation that was really spread out.
Well,
really mean stuff, really mean stuff.
I mean, again, I'm interested. My class will not be just prose. I mean, it'll have fiction, nonfiction, it'll have poetry, it'll have film, it'll have, theater. And I'm definitely taking a couple of chapters from Sarah's book. Sure. So it'll include, but I'm interested in, if we look at all that time, can we predict how the writing about COVID will become?
Yeah. And of course, as we know, as writers and historians and archivists, we know that the history actually ends up being whatever tracks have been laid. And if we don't lay those proper tracks down, if we don't allow these things to persist, then shame on us, because we've allowed somebody else's history to be out there.
And that's what the sort of the anger in the Angel of History is about, that the narrator wanted to go. I mean, in the book, I talk about that it was understandable, you know, I mean, the narrator and I as well wanted to go on living, and we couldn't, you know, stay stuck in the AIDS crisis and all the deaths and dying. So we put it aside for a while. It's just that once you put it aside, somebody else comes and takes over and gives you a completely different history.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let's talk about the wrong end of the telescope. This book came out this year, and how long has this work been in the works?
It's, you know, it's difficult to answer a question like that, because different, you know, when a novel starts is a weird thing. There's a section in the novel that I wrote more than 20 years ago, and it was published in a book more than 20 years ago. Just, you know, when it came time to write it, and I was actually towards the end, and I'm thinking like, oh, I wrote about this, and I just took that from. So is that when it started? Primarily, you know, I started working with refugees when the first crisis happened, so 2012 maybe. And I tried to write various essays to help in any way, and then I was listening to stories, and I wasn't able to write much. It was terrible, whatever I wrote. So it took a long time, but those were probably the first sort of inkling. You know, at first I wanted to help. I thought if I would write an essay, then, you know, I did something. I wasn't able to write an essay till I think it was 2017. And then it was, yeah, about what happened in Lesbos. And lots of parts of that essays were in the novel. But primarily the novel came in various stages. By 2016, when I went to Lesbos, I sort of had an issue, you know. I'm not saying that the narrator is me, but, you know, we had some things in common. I had a freak out, basically. After working for years, you know, Lesbos just drove me crazy, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And when something like that happened, my answer is always to, you know, write about it. And I wasn't able to, until, you know, finally I was writing this other short story with the character Mina, and it was a completely different story. And then she comes into the book, and all of a sudden everything fits into place. Yeah. So maybe 2016 was when it started really getting going.
And tell us about Mina, and also let's just set it up just so that we've got it clear that what the story is about is, and correct me if I have any of these facts wrong, but it's a transgender woman doctor who is trying to assist Syrian refugees in Greece.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's a single sentence. And the time period we're looking at is, when we think about Syrian refugees, we're thinking about the most recent conflict in Syria.
And so the timing was specific because, you know, that was when I was there. So the timing is the first week of the year, so January of 2016. I don't know whether you remember, but the big sort of crisis was in the fall of 2015 when we started it. I mean, the crisis had been ongoing for a while, but we started hearing about the drownings, and then the boy, Alan Kurdi, or Alan Chinno as his real name is, appeared, and there was this picture of him, the drowned boy on the beach, and then the big sort of the story just came out.
Yeah.
So when I arrived, it was after New Year's, and so that's when the setting is for the story, when Mina arrives. So again, I use my kind of background to write a different kind of story with a different narrator.
And so Mina had already been created by that time, as you say, through another short story.
I think so, but I cannot be sure. It could have been created later.
Okay.
But I started thinking about a novel at that time, and I got so frustrated and stuff. And so maybe a little bit later that I wrote the short story, and it had a different, it wasn't about the refugees.
Mm.
And then when we combined the two, it actually worked. Yeah.
Well, it's just so fascinating to see these incredibly current, fraught-ridden situations, the Syrian refugee situation, and just how many of us believe that many trans people have to fight their way through the world. To see those two at the same time in a contemporary novel like this, that's so well researched and beautifully written. I think for me, that's what makes this book so poignant, is the timing of it am I watching MSNBC or am I reading a novel?
I love that, because again, when I was writing, I wasn't thinking about any of that. She was a trans refugee. I mean, you mentioned Susan Strucker. She's a close friend. I mean, like for me, it is not incidental that she is trans. Mm-hmm. I wanted, the whole idea of refugees and immigrants is what we leave behind. And in many ways, we have to recreate ourselves constantly. And I thought in many ways, a trans person is also a refugee. So I started, thinking about, and this is probably when I brought her over. But again, it's difficult because I was writing about something that I know and love. It was not, I wasn't trying to be topical, even though I have no objection. I could, I'd love to be topical all the time. Yeah. It's like, but no, that was not in my mind.
Yeah. And I don't mean to imply that it feels
forced. Oh, no. I'm not insulted at all. I just would sometimes think, I wish I could think of something that would be topical.
That would be the one I imagine would be the flop, the one that gets forced in that way, as opposed to one that just comes out naturally and at the time. And also it's interesting too, as we age, also that, we can make some of these decisions that we don't really think about them, but that there is a certain amount of wisdom associated with experience. You got to get
lived life. I mean, the reason I'm able to write about, Mina, and if you want to call it trans issues, which were, I really wasn't thinking about that, is because I've lived long enough to have had many trans friends.
Yes.
If you told me to write this in, when I wrote Kool-Aids, I probably wouldn't have been able to, because I didn't know anybody. It's like my experience has grown to encompass a lot, including, re-examining who I am and what I am, and it's truly interesting to me how many people think that it must have been really difficult to write about a trans woman. And I keep saying that, the more difficult thing was writing about a surgeon. I had less issues writing about Mina being trans than about Mina being a surgeon. That was so out of my experience. It's not that I am trans, but I am trans adjacent.
Well, not to oversimplify it, but as members of the gay community or the queer community or the LGBTQ community, if we haven't absorbed a lot of this stuff
Thank you.
and are not empathetic toward it and understanding what people go through, shame on us. I would agree with you. The technical side of understanding what a surgeon is thinking about
Was completely out of my reality.
Yeah. Or for me, what an engineer was. Yeah, that would have been easier if you made her an engineer. At least you would have known a little bit more about it.
Exactly. And so the trans stuff, I mean, yes, I had to, to ask Susan many questions. She read it, 3 times, but for the most part, it's just, I could easily imagine me as a trans woman, easily. Yeah. I've imagined it more than once. An unnecessary woman is a 72-year-old, woman who's a recluse and dyes her hair blue. It's like, that's probably the most biographical thing I've written. So it's like I said, those things are not difficult if you have lived, shall we say, a good life.
Yeah, and also I think too, I was going to mention that as well too, in the sense that, an unnecessary woman, and also elsewhere in your writings. I mean, you certainly have been able to lay down a credible, active voice of a woman in these, that one that doesn't have to be a woman in order to be able to do that. Well, let's, if I can get you. There are 2 readings that we talked about. One is The Little Rascals Go to Camp, and the other one is Dreamhouse Maintenance. Do you have a preference of either one of those?
The dream, it's like it depends on, usually it depends on the audience, but I don't know who the audience is because I can't see them. Dreamhouse is more emotional, shall we say, whereas Little Rascals is more funny. And I mean, it is still poignant, but it's more funny than more amusing.
Yeah. Well, if I can, I would love to hear both, but can we start with Dreamhouse? Do you have some water there or something to drink?
I have my kombucha.
Oh, perfect.
So you want Dreamhouse?
Yes, please.
Okay.
This chapter is entitled Dreamhouse Maintenance, and it's on page 253, or 252, sorry.
And it is the narrator, Mina, is talking to the unnamed writer. Dreamhouse Maintenance. Your father built the house of his dream in his home village in the mountains of Lebanon, not far from the house he grew up in, the one his father had built. Before he broke ground, your father, though not very religious, did what every Druze man should when building or buying something new. He visited one of the Druze elders, a man in his late 80s who lived in a tiny village that was difficult to reach, hidden in a verdant valley encircled by high mountains. Your father asked the elder to bless his new home, which the man did by writing a little prayer on a piece of paper, which he folded and put in a small envelope that was essentially another folded piece of cardstock paper, a Lebanese origami. Your father placed that blessing, no bigger than a child's finger, between the first 2 stones laid down for the house. The House of Dreams was finished in 1974. And what a house it was. Overlooking the city of Beirut, it was sleek and modern, distinct and sui generis. Melding into the hills around it, but unlike any other building in the area. In the middle of the house was the pièce de résistance, a glassed-in room with an open-air top, in which grew an old olive tree. But when your father covered the top with chicken wire and began to fill the room with birds, all kinds of birds. Canaries at first, for the song, goldfinches to sing back, then local larks, finches, warblers, and bee-eaters. When he included the first weavers, your father had to fill the room with dried grass and dead plants so those yellow things with feathers could build their intricate nests. He brought in nightingales, but they didn't sing. From the Netherlands, he purchased imported birds of paradise with ridiculously long tails. The aviary became his passion. Everybody loved it, even you, cynical you. But were you cynical then? You have often written that 1974, when you were 14, a year before the civil war started in Lebanon, was the single happiest year of your life. You found out that you could pass for normal for short bursts of time, after which you had a good hiding place, your bedroom with a never-ending bookshelf in your new house. You would be able to make it. Not a happy existence, but still survival. Existence in and of itself was an accomplishment. But violence descended, only it wasn't directed at you personally as you had expected. The Lebanese civil war erupted, and you were bundled up and sent out of the country for safekeeping, the young immigrant. The house remained, though. Throughout the early stages of the war, nothing touched it. Pressed and flattened between the first two stones, that tiny paper prayer worked its magic. Every time you visited during those first few years, the first few years of the war, and you did that quite a bit, you noticed that the house stood proud, not a scratch. Every house in the village had a pointillist array of bullet holes, but not your father's. A missile would fall in the orchard. A grenade would explode on the main road, but the birds in your father's house kept singing. A miracle, if there ever was one. Christian militias, Druze or Muslim ones, they couldn't harm your father's house. The Syrian army, Palestinian fighters. The house existed beyond the ravenous cruelty of the war and its mundanity. Bullets, rocket-propelled grenades, missiles, they all bypassed it, swerved and detoured. The wonder lasted for 7 glorious years, but then the Israelis invaded. Would the Israelis understand paper prayers? Could the talisman protect against the evil eye of an invading army? Was Druze juju translatable into Hebrew? A most definite yes, it seemed. Phylacteries were as common among Jews as they were among the Druze. There were a couple of close calls. When the tanks arrived on the hill above your father's house, a general's megaphone voice warned the village not to harbor any terrorists. The latter defined as anyone who was not welcoming the neighborly Israeli invasion with enough cheer. 15,000 Lebanese were killed within the first 2 weeks of the Israeli invasion, which obviously meant they were all uncheerful terrorists. If the villagers did not want to be shocked and awed by having their homes bombed into oblivion, they should raise a white flag on the roof to indicate that there were no unfriendly terrorists in the house. Your mother stripped all the linens off the bed and hung the white sheets on the roof's laundry lines. She worried that would not be enough. For 2 days, while the tanks loomed above her home, your mother ran back and forth along the laundry lines, shaking the sheets to make sure they were seen from above. Possessed by Lisa, the spirit of madness and frenzy, your mother set herself up between the folds of each sheet and swayed her arms back and forth, then moved to the next sheet and the next for 48 hours in a row. The prayer blessing worked on the Israelis, with little help from your mother acting like a Halloween ghost on meth, not a scrape, not a blemish on the house. A week after your mother shook the sheets, a young Israeli soldier knocked on the large mahogany door. Your parents saw a shy, scrawny, mild-mannered boy. He looked 14 at best. Your mother told you, his glasses too big for his face. She wanted to drag him to your room, order him to go get out of the idiotic uniform, grab a bath, pick something normal to wear from your closet, and then she would feed him. The soldier, speaking fluent Levantine Arabic, apologized profusely for disturbing them. So much so that your parents began to feel guilty for appearing intimidating to the poor boy. He had heard the birds, he told them, all the way down the street. He followed the sounds to the house, just as Melquiades, the gypsy in 100 Years of Solitude, found his way to Macondo by following the song of the birds. Beautiful singing. Some trills the boy knew, but some he could not identify. He was going to study ornithology, you see. He was obsessed with birds, like his own father was. He hadn't been sure where the birdsong was coming from until that day, when he finally had a break. He was not supposed to wander on his own, he said, but the siren song called to him. He begged for permission to see the birds, if only for a moment. Of course, your parents let him in. Your father may have despised the Israelis, but a young man who loved birds couldn't be a terrible person. The young man was stunned when he saw the glassed-in room. Sunlight inside the house, the outdoors, indoors, and birds, a profusion of birds. He had a look of such longing that your father forgave his trespasses, almost his country's as well, but not quite. The coffee came out, the entire hospitality accoutrements, almonds, candies, chocolate. Even in the middle of the war, one must be prepared for guests. When your mother complimented the soldier on his Arabic, he explained that his mother was Druze and his father Jewish. He spoke Arabic with his mother's family and Hebrew with his father's. He had problems, he said, answering your mother's questions. He was Jewish, but not technically since his mother wasn't, and he wasn't Druze because his father wasn't. He felt homeless, he said, which of course elicited hostile homilies from your parents. Their home was his home, he would always be welcome, the usual stuff. He asked if he could visit again when the Israeli army withdrew. On the way back was how he phrased it. Surely this invasion would not last long. Of course, your parents assured him, if they were still around, if he remembered, then his visit would be most welcome. You didn't know whether he remembered, but luckily, your family was no longer around. The Israelis went insane, bombing Beirut incessantly. Even though the house wasn't in danger, your family decided to pack as much as they could and left for the safety of Damascus. Your parents left as soon as the Americans got involved. The Israelis forced the Lebanese parliament to elect the head of the phalange as president, and he was assassinated soon after. The Israeli army surrounded the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, and the phalangists massacred thousands of women and children as Ariel Sharon smoked his hookah and cheered from its sidelines. Oh, the hand-wringing at the UN. Israel decided it would occupy only the south of Lebanon. The civil war flared up again. The American Marines got involved in the war. Unfortunately for your family, Americans don't understand paper prayers. Druze juju would not translate to English. Blessings were not America's forte. One morning, for reasons no one could fathom, the battleship New Jersey, cruising in the Mediterranean, a tad off the Lebanese shores, fired its 16-inch shells into various villages in the mountains, killing who knows how many. One of those shells fell through the roof of your father's dream house, incinerating everything. The structure remained standing for the most part, roofless but standing. Nothing inside was unharmed. The birds were roasted alive. After its murderous foray into Lebanese politics, the New Jersey was retired, the last of its kind. The shell that destroyed your home might have been the last 16-incher to be fired. Don't you feel special? The Americans? A man drove a truck full of explosives into the US barracks just outside of Beirut, killing 241 young Marines. Reagan withdrew all his forces, washing his hands of irrational Lebanon, calling the Lebanese terrorists, terrorists, terrorists that kill innocent peacekeepers. Why couldn't they fight fairly, like decent people, using battleships, fighter jets, shock and awe? Your mother would phone you in your small apartment in San Francisco. Your father was devastated. He didn't know what to do anymore. Your house was more than his pride and joy, she explained. The house was him, and he was the house. The battleship destroyed him. He had no idea who he was anymore. He tried to be stoic. He was a man's man, after all. He'd tell her that they should build another house, maybe buy an apartment in Beirut or start anew and move to Paris. But she had caught him surreptitiously weeping on more than one occasion, whenever he thought no one was watching. She wished you were there to comfort him. But what could you do? What could you do? You were in graduate school. You had to get another degree in order to become a productive member of an evil society. You gobbled up hamburgers and quenched your thirst with Coke. You dove into gay sex clubs every night. You were assimilating. You were assimilating, for crying out loud. You did not wish to remain an outsider in your adopted country. How could you explain to your father that you were not coming back, that you were choosing to become a citizen of the country that destroyed his dream with a single 16-inch shell? Which side were you on? You would try to become an American, become one with people who would rather see your family dead. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
An amazing piece of literature and also such an amazing personal story. You of course had said that it was the more intense of the two, but the personal element of what you bring here, how you capture so much in this one chapter, is I think just incredibly profound. Yes. So I guess we're almost out of time here, but I just have one question about that. Well, I have many questions, but I will offer just one, which is about the birds. And so did you have an experience with an aviary?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. Tell me about that.
I did. There was things made up about that thing, but the aviary in the house was not.
Yes, yeah, it's such a wonderful. It's one of the sweetest. I mean, there's so many amazing things in there, but it's such a beautiful way of being able to look at that. Mm-hmm. Well, this has been an amazing and powerful chat. As I said, it was going to go by lickety split, and here we are at the end of the hour here. And so I want to thank you for your time. Don't wait for the next hockey game, gay hockey game, to get you to Fort Lauderdale. Mm-hmm. I would love to be able to have you here and look in the archives and to look in the library as well too, because it's so rich, and of course how much you mine from the past is so incredibly important. And so it would be lovely to have you here. We do have somebody working on an exhibition right now about the lack of Muslim individuals in South Florida and in the gay community in particular, and how they were non-existent. A young man from Afghan is working on putting that exhibition together right now. And it's been quite a journey for him to go through some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. It would be. It's a strange time.
Yes. Well, Rabih, it's great to meet you. I want to say hello or say goodbye to our colleague, Paula Sierra here. And Paula, nice to see you again. Paula, thank you. We want to thank all of you for joining us, and be sure to join us next week. I forget who we have, but we do have another talk next week, and we'll see you all then. And until then, take care of each other and stay safe. Good night, everyone.
Good night.